Greetings, dear subscribers and casual listeners of my channel. Fred and George Weasley have made readers and viewers laugh countless times, brightening the often grim reality of Hogwarts with their pranks and antics. But, let's be honest, there's more to them than meets the eye. Today, we'll explore the darker side of Weasley humour and look at why some fans have criticised these beloved jokers. Number 1, their jokes could be downright cruel. Yes, Fred and George are the undisputed kings of mischief, but they've crossed the line more than once. Slytherin students often bore the brunt of their jokes, not because of anything they'd done, but simply for being in the wrong house. Remember when they booed a first-year student just for being sorted into Slytherin? Or when they gifted Ron a toy spider as kids, planting the seed of his lifelong arachnophobia? Not exactly harmless fun. Number 2. Compassion wasn't their strong suit. The twins were always chasing laughs, but rarely stopped to think about how their targets felt. Getting a crowd to laugh seemed more important than the emotional toll their jokes might take. Their pranks weren't always mean-spirited, but empathy and sensitivity weren't part of their usual toolkit. Number 3, their joke shop. Ethically questionable? Weasley's Wizard. Wheezes became a dream come true for pranksters everywhere, but some of their products seriously pushed ethical boundaries. Take their love potions, for instance, already a controversial item in the Harry Potter universe, yet Fred and George sold them like innocent souvenirs. We all remember what happened. Harry nearly fell victim to Romilda Vane's enchanted chocolates. Sure, the user carries some responsibility, but the seller shouldn't be let off the hook either. Number 4, disrespect for rules. And no consequences? Fred and George broke just about every rule at Hogwarts and somehow made it to their final year. It often felt like the staff simply turned a blind eye to their behaviour, possibly because they were Quidditch stars. Only Professor Umbridge seemed to rein them in, albeit with highly questionable methods. Still, the fact remains, the twins were practically untouchable. Number 5. Humour that crosses the line. Some of their pranks didn't land with laughter, but with discomfort. The twins clearly enjoyed the reactions, even if it meant fear or irritation. When Hermione called out their behaviour, they brushed her off with, "You just don't have a sense of humour." But in truth, there's a fine line between funny and hurtful, and not everyone has the instinct to tell the difference. Number 6, not everyone found them funny. Yes, Fred and George had many hilarious moments, especially in the Gryffindor common room. But humour is subjective. Plenty of fans found their jokes forced and their lines predictable. For some, they were favourites. For others, just loud distractions who broke the flow of more serious moments. Number 7, not always the best brothers. The Weasley family has always charmed fans with its warmth, but Fred and George's role in Ron and Ginny's lives raises some concerns. Instead of uplifting their younger siblings, they often mocked Ron, damaging his self-esteem. His fear of spiders, his scorched tongue, the constant teasing. That's not exactly the support a younger brother needs to grow confident. And Ginny? She rarely received genuine care or attention from them, at least not enough to be worth mentioning in the books. Number 8, they are careless with others' safety. Fred and George loved chaos. The bigger the boom, the louder the laugh. That was their fuel. Safety? An afterthought. Warnings for other people. They didn't prank, they detonated. The fireworks stunt nearly set the corridor on fire. A serpent rocket slammed into the wall. Curtains lit up. Smoke filled the air. Second years screamed and ran. One girl fainted. Her robes were scorched. Fred waved it off. Just a bit of extra sparkle. McGonagall wasn't smiling. You could have burned down the castle. George just grinned. Well, it didn't. Then came the dungeon disaster. Stink bombs, slime, slipping. 2 kids crashed into a boiling cauldron. A Slytherin boy's arm blistered instantly. Snape was furious. This is criminally reckless, he shouted. Fred looked away. George picked at his sleeve. No jokes, not this time. Even their joke sweets caused real harm. Canary creams were supposed to be funny, until one boy didn't change back. Yellow feathers. Beak. Panic. He hid in the bathroom, sobbing. I didn't know it had hurt, he whispered. But the twins never came to check. They called it testing, said it was part of the fun. But bruises aren't fun, burns aren't clever, magic isn't a toy. One wrong spell and someone bleeds. But Fred and George only saw the laughs. Number 9, they showed disrespect for authority. Fred and George didn't just break rules, they mocked them, tore them apart with a grin. Their fight with Umbridge made them legends. But their war with authority started long before her. For the twins, every rule was a joke, every order was a challenge. Even McGonagall struggled with them, and she liked them, saw their potential, tried to guide them. You're both capable of greatness, she told them once. Fred nodded. We're planning something big, Professor. She didn't realize he meant fireworks over the Great Hall. When she caught them red-handed, George just smirked. Bit of creative expression, that's all. They didn't hate injustice. They hated being told what to do. Any rule, no matter how fair, was the enemy. Snape, Filch, Flitwick, Sprout, all targets. Orders became punchlines, punishments became stories. They didn't rebel to make things better. They rebelled because it was fun. Their war on Umbridge looked heroic. Fireworks, escape, applause. But it wasn't the start of a revolution. It was the peak of a habit of ignoring every voice but their own, a habit that made rebellion seem like a game. Number 10, they don't think about consequences. Fred and George never stopped to think. They moved fast, loud, wild, always chasing the next boom, the next laugh, the next headline. Consequences? That was someone else's problem. They once dumped a potion at the entrance to the Slytherin common room. The floor turned to soap. Students slipped, crashed, fell. One boy broke his wrist. Snape was furious. This is criminal, he spat. Fred just grinned. Bit of a slip-up, George added. They'll bounce back. But the boy didn't bounce. He spent a week in the hospital wing. Their fireworks were chaos. Dragons roared across the Great Hall. Fireworks spun like blades. One nearly hit Flitwick in the face. He ducked, just barely. You could have killed someone, McGonagall snapped. George shrugged. Just a little spark. They never saw the fear in the younger kids' eyes, or maybe they did and laughed anyway. Their big escape was legend, brooms, fireworks, Peeves saluting. Give her hell from us, Peeves, Fred yelled. The school went wild, but when the smoke faded, no exams, no plan, just a sack of tricks and a hope it would work. It did, for them. But what if it hadn't? They made it look easy, like rules were a joke, like planning was for fools. Kids watched them and believed it, believed they could leap without looking too, but most can't, most fall. And Fred and George were already gone by then. They weren't villains, but they were reckless, and that's dangerous, especially when others follow. Magic isn't a game, not when someone else ends up bleeding or forgotten, while the pranksters fly off into the sunset. Number 11, they abuse their magical talents. Fred and George were geniuses. No one argued that. Their spells were sharp, their potions unmatched. They created magic most adult wizards couldn't dream of. But instead of building something good, they built chaos, explosions, tricks, trouble. Their skiving snack boxes were shiny. Bright wrappers, funny names. Fainting fancies. Nosebleed nougat. Kids lined up to buy them, but the effects were real, violent. A Hufflepuff girl once collapsed in class, cold, pale. Her friend screamed, "She's not breathing right." Madame Pomfrey stormed in. "Who gave her this?" Fred shrugged. "Just a sweet. The fireworks stunt during dinner, a disaster. Dragons made of flames soared through the great hall. One screeched and slammed into a wall. Another clipped a Ravenclaw boy's arm. His robe caught fire. He screamed. McGonagall froze it with one word. "Enough," she said. "Someone could have died." Fred and George just bowed. They hexed toilets to spit water at anyone who passed, made steps vanish under students' feet. Once, a first-year tripped, hit the floor hard, and cried. George whispered, "Oops." Fred added, "Work in progress." But it wasn't funny to the boy who limped for a week. They had talent, real talent, enough to invent, create, lead. But they used it for gags, for jokes that left people burned, bruised, or embarrassed. Their spells were clever, but careless. Magic is power, and power has weight. Fred and George didn't feel it. Or maybe they ignored it. Because it's easier to get applause than to take responsibility. And they always chose the laugh. Number 12, they don't respect other people's efforts. Fred and George hated anything that looked too serious. Hard work? Boring. Rules? Lame. Ambition? Hilarious. If someone tried too hard, they made it a joke, no matter how much it meant to that person. Percy got the worst of it. He stayed up late, read ministry reports for fun, polished his prefect badge until it gleamed. He cared, maybe too much, but it mattered to him. And the twins, they tore it down. "Minister for Magic coming through," Fred would shout, saluting. George would toss a scroll at him. "Your latest masterpiece, sir?" Percy clenched his jaw, but he said nothing because they wouldn't listen. Hermione fought back. When she launched SPEW, she was on fire. Charts, banners, knitted hats. Fred laughed. "House elves in uniforms. What next, Hermione? Elf unions?" George made the socks dance like puppets. "Free at last!" The common room howled. Hermione didn't. Her face was pale. "You don't care," she whispered. "You never care." They just kept laughing. Ron wasn't safe either. He once worked for hours on a charm, practiced until his fingers shook. The feather lifted. He beamed. "Well done," Harry clapped. Hermione smiled. Then Fred leaned in. "Look out, Ron," he said, smirking. "One more spell and you'll turn into Percy." Ron didn't answer. He just looked down. The twins didn't think. They joked first. Always. If something wasn't funny, it wasn't worth their time. Feelings didn't matter. Pride didn't matter. They never saw how many people they silenced. Not everyone wants to be the class clown. Some people want to be seen. But Fred and George were too loud to notice. They didn't mean to hurt, but they did. Again and again. And no one dared tell them to stop. Number 13, they're bad role models. Fred and George were legends. Loud, fearless, unstoppable. First years stared at them like gods. Every prank was a show, every joke a headline. But legends aren't always role models, and the twins, they taught the wrong lessons. Colin Creevey tried to follow their lead. He hexed his camera to spray ink, thought it to be funny. It wasn't. The ink hit a girl in the face. She screamed. Madame Pomfrey said it nearly damaged her eyes. Colin stood frozen. "I thought Fred and George would think it's cool," he mumbled. But they weren't there to help. They never were when things went wrong. Fred once said, "Studying's for people with no imagination." George laughed. "Grades don't matter when you're this brilliant." They tossed spellbooks across the common room. Everyone cheered except Hermione. She slammed her book shut. "You're poisoning this place," she hissed. "Some of us care about our future." The twins just grinned. They didn't just break rules, they made a game out of it. Once they stole Filch's entire keyring. Doors jammed, stairs locked, chaos. George threw the keys to Peeves. "Start a revolution, my friend." Fred bowed like a king. Filch nearly cried. Dumbledore said nothing, but the message was clear. No one could stop them. Ron once tried to copy them, snuck into the kitchens with Seamus, got caught. Ginny brewed a prank potion in 3rd year, exploded in the hallway. She cried. Molly didn't scold, just stared at the mess. "You two broke the rules," she said quietly. "Now everyone else thinks it's brave." Fred and George were fireworks, bright, loud, gone too fast. But fireworks don't teach you how to grow or how to care. They only show you how to burn. Number 14. They are selfish toward their parents. Fred and George didn't ask. They never asked. Not when they broke school rules, not when they quit school, not even when they left home without a plan. They just did it, with fire, with flair, with broomsticks and fireworks, and they never looked back. Molly and Arthur gave them everything. Warm food, open arms, love in a house held together by hope. And still, the twins acted like it wasn't enough. They laughed at Percy relentlessly. "Minister in training," Fred would mock, fake quill in hand. George would bow. "Permission to speak, oh mighty prefect." Percy burned with shame. Molly winced, but they didn't stop. Then came the day they left Hogwarts. No warnings, no letters, no time for goodbyes, just a bang so loud it shook the castle. They flew out through the storm of their own making. "Give her hell from us, Peeves," Fred shouted, and just like that they were gone. Molly stood in the burrow kitchen, hands shaking. Her sons had vanished into the sky. She had begged them. "Just take your exams, please." Her voice cracked. "You need a future." But they smiled. "We've got one," George said. "We're building it ourselves." No diploma, no ministry job, just dreams and chaos. And she was supposed to be happy for them? Even the joke shop was a shock. They bought it in secret, opened it without telling her. "You're doing what?" she asked, voice rising. "Selling trick wands? Skiving snack boxes?" Fred grinned. "It's genius." But all she felt was fear. 2 sons, out there, in the middle of Diagon Alley, with no safety net. Number 15. They disregard personal boundaries. Fred and George Weasley were born to break rules. That's what made them funny and dangerous. At Hogwarts, they were kings of chaos, grinning, scheming, unstoppable. But there's a fine line between mischief and disrespect, and they crossed it. Often, like the time they borrowed Ron's owl, Pigwidgeon, just to send prank letters. Ron exploded. "That's my owl!" he shouted. "You can't just take him." Fred laughed it off. "Relax, Ronnie, it's a joke." But it wasn't. Pigwidgeon carried Ron's letters from Hermione, private things, not a playground for brothers who treated everything like a laugh. One Christmas, they stormed the girls' dorm with enchanted snowballs. Alicia Spinette screamed. Angelina flung a slipper. "Get out!" she yelled. "Now!" George bowed with a smirk. "Spreading cheer," he said. No one smiled. The dorm was supposed to be safe. That night, it wasn't. Hermione had her battles too, especially with Spew. Fred pinned one of her badges on a dung bomb. George called it a tribute. She froze. Her voice shook. "You mock what you don't understand." George winked. "It's just a badge, Granger." But it wasn't. It was her cause. Number 16. They can't take criticism. Of all the colourful personalities in the wizarding world, Fred and George Weasley shine the brightest. Witty, daring, and endlessly inventive, they command attention and laughter wherever they go. But underneath the firework displays, joke products, and cheeky grins, there's a part of them that many overlook, a stubborn resistance to criticism. It's a subtle flaw, overshadowed by their charisma, yet it becomes obvious when the laughter fades and someone dares to question them. They are masters of satire, quick with a jibe or a wink, But when the tables turn and they become the subjects of scrutiny, their defenses rise like a wall of enchanted shields. Consider the moment in their 6th year Hermione Granger, always the voice of reason, confronted them about the potential dangers of their new line of joke products. "You can't just sell something without knowing the long-term effects," she had said, her brows knitted, eyes sharp. She wasn't being bossy for the sake of it. She had tested their skiving snack boxes on unsuspecting first years and seen a boy vomit so violently he had to be taken to Madame Pomfrey. And still, Fred only smirked. "Lighten up, Hermione, it's just a bit of fun." George chimed in with a grin. Besides, it worked exactly as advertised. The tension in the air didn't dissipate. Hermione, clearly frustrated, pressed on, but her concerns were deflected, dodged, laughed off. This wasn't an isolated case. It was a pattern. Fred and George had grown so accustomed to being the clever ones, the rebels, the ones who always had the last word, that being questioned struck a chord they refused to acknowledge. Their humour, while often brilliant, doubled as a weapon and a shield, a way to protect their ego from the vulnerability that came with being wrong. In the face of criticism, they didn't listen. They performed. When Professor McGonagall once questioned the suitability of their pranks inside the castle, Fred simply bowed dramatically and said, "We'll be sure to notify you next time we plan to install a swamp." McGonagall's stern look didn't faze them. They wore it like a badge of honor. It wasn't just rebellion, it was pride and a refusal to be corrected. Even when the head of their own house suggested they might use their talents for something more substantial, they chose to interpret it as an encouragement for mischief, not an invitation to reflect. Hermione, for all her logic and rules, genuinely cared. She saw their potential. She knew they could change the world, not just with jokes, but with their minds, their courage, and their creativity. "You're both brilliant," she once told them, "but you could be brilliant and responsible." George had winked. "Responsible's not really our style." And that was that. A wall went up. A joke was made. The moment passed, but the issue went deeper than a few shrugged-off comments. It spoke to an immaturity, a reluctance to grow beyond the image they had built for themselves. They feared that accepting criticism might tarnish their brand, the image of the fearless pranksters, the ones who didn't care what anyone thought. Ironically, they cared deeply, just not in the way that allowed them to change. It's clear in Order of the Phoenix, when Umbridge takes over Hogwarts, that Fred and George are capable of serious rebellion with purpose. Their final prank, flooding the school with fireworks and a portable swamp, was a powerful act of resistance, but even in that moment when so many students saw them as heroes, they rejected any suggestion that they take their role seriously. "Time to give the Ministry the slip," Fred said with his usual grin, as they flew off into the sky. No farewells, no acknowledgement of the danger, just spectacle. Harry, too, had moments where he tried to steer them toward caution. He watched their experiments, their casual disregard for consequences, and worried. But Fred and George lived by the code of laughter above all. Caution wasn't in their vocabulary unless it came with a punchline. In Half-Blood Prince, when their joke shop, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, becomes a roaring success, even Mrs. Weasley, who had once doubted them, has to admit their brilliance. And yet, when she expresses concern over their more extreme products, like shield hats and decoy detonators, they brush it off. "We're just helping the cause," George says. "And making a bit of galleon while we're at it," Fred adds with a wink. There's no room for dialogue, only defense. It's a deflection, not a discussion. And what about Ron? Their own younger brother? Fred and George love him, no doubt, but their teasing often borders on cruel. When Ron becomes a prefect, they mock him rather than congratulate. "Wow, we're going to have to watch our step around you now, eh?" Fred jeers. Underneath the laughter there's a trace of jealousy, perhaps even resentment. And when Ron stumbles or makes a mistake, they're quick to point it out. But if he ever dared critique them, he'd be met with a barrage of sarcasm, a rolling of eyes, a joke to shut him down. They weren't bad people, not even close. But they were human, and like many brilliant, confident people, they struggled to admit fault. In Goblet of Fire, when their attempts to hoodwink the Goblet of Fire fail, leaving them with beards and grey hair, they laugh along with everyone else, but it stings. And when Hermione tries to point out that the rules exist for a reason, George snaps, "Yeah, well, maybe the rules are stupid." The sting of failure masked in rebellion. Even Dumbledore, who supported them quietly, never pushed them too hard. Perhaps he saw what others did not, that their resistance to criticism came from a fear of being ordinary. If they weren't the funny ones, the innovators, the wild cards, then who were they? Number 17, they lack gratitude. Fred and George Weasley were the brightest sparks in a family of embers, the two boys who always stood out with their irreverent jokes, constant laughter, and a gift for mischief that sometimes seemed more magical than their wands. From their first appearance in the Sorcerer's Stone, it was clear they lived by their own rules. But beneath the charm and chaos, one thing often went unnoticed, or perhaps deliberately ignored: the lack of simple, heartfelt gratitude. Not only toward their family, but even toward the boy who made their dreams possible. The Weasley family was never rich. Molly knitted sweaters by hand for Christmas. Arthur collected Muggle junk and treasured it like gold. Bill and Charlie left home early to send back money. Percy clawed his way into the ministry with rigid discipline. Ron wore second-hand everything. In that house, a sickle saved was a sickle earned. Everyone understood this, except, maybe, Fred and George. While they did work hard, they lived as though they were somehow separate from that constant struggle. Even as teenagers, they seemed dismissive of the sacrifices made around them. They skipped school rules, scorned prefects, and didn't hesitate to use family resources like Owlpost or Family Connections for their latest joke or invention. Perhaps the most striking example of this ungrateful streak was their reaction to Harry's generosity. In the Goblet of Fire, after Harry won the Triwizard Tournament, he found himself with a small fortune, 1,000 galleons. He had no desire to keep the prize money. Cedric was dead. The cup had been a trap. It was blood money, and he wanted rid of it. So he did something deeply selfless. He handed the gold to Fred and George. You know the Muggle trick of putting a few sickles in an empty tin and shaking it to make it sound like there's lots of coins in it? Harry told them. Use your imagination. That moment was profound, not only because Harry gave away a huge sum, but because he chose to give it to the twins. He didn't ask for repayment, he didn't expect a return, but what he likely did expect, what any friend would, is gratitude. And yet, throughout the rest of the series, the twins never truly offer a sincere thank you. There is no tender scene of appreciation, no moment where they acknowledge what Harry did. They go on to build Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, their dream joke shop, and it becomes a booming success. But Harry remains the silent investor, forgotten even in private words of thanks. Even Ron, their younger brother, is taken aback by how easily they accept this windfall without reflection. You gave them your winnings, are you mental? He exclaims when Harry tells him. But Fred and George don't respond to Ron's disbelief with humility. Instead, they take the money and run with it, literally, leaving school in a fiery blaze of rebellion that was admittedly brilliant, but also, in a deeper sense, self-centered. Their relationship with their mother also hints at this ungrateful streak. Molly Weasley, perhaps the most loving and self-sacrificing character in the series, is often reduced to the butt of their jokes. While some of their teasing is affectionate, there are moments when it veers into dismissiveness. She worries over their future, begs them to take their studies seriously, and even offers them emotional support when no one else does. Yet they often respond with flippant remarks or distractions. "Time is galleons, Mum," Fred quips in Order of the Phoenix when she tries to reason with them. It's clever, it's funny, but it also dismisses the woman who scraped together every nook to keep them fed. When they finally succeed, one might hope they'd at least credit her support. But no such scene exists. There's no moment of triumph where they say, "Mum, we couldn't have done this without you." There's no mention of Arthur, who quietly believed in them, even as he confiscated their more dangerous experiments. Their shop becomes a monument to their brilliance, but not to their roots. Contrast this with Percy, who, despite all his flaws, ultimately returns to the family with remorse. In the Deathly Hallows, Percy breaks down and apologizes. He admits he was wrong. "I'm sorry, Dad, I was a fool." He shows gratitude for being welcomed back, even after his betrayal. That act of humility, of recognizing those who stood by him, redeems Percy in ways Fred and George never seek for themselves. It's also worth noting how their attitude influences those around them. Younger students idolize them. Lee Jordan, for example, cheers on their every stunt. But admiration is not the same as depth. Their influence fosters rebellion, not reflection. In the chaotic halls of Hogwarts, perhaps that's enough. But in the real world, where relationships are built on trust, effort, and yes, gratitude, it feels lacking. Even during the darkest moments, their irreverence overshadows intimacy. After Dumbledore dies, when the whole school mourns, Fred and George's grief is not deeply explored. Do they ever sit quietly with Ginny or Ron to talk about the loss? Do they show appreciation for the man who protected their family again and again? The text is silent, perhaps because they themselves are silent. Fred's death in the Deathly Hallows is tragic, no doubt. It's a gut punch that breaks the family. But it also brings a question into focus. Had he lived, would he have ever truly matured? Would he have ever looked at Harry, or Molly, or even Ron, and said, "Thank you"? Or would he have continued believing that laughter was enough, that being beloved excused the need for grace? George's reaction to Fred's death is devastating. His silence, his withdrawn demeanor, the empty twin bond, these are profound signs of grief. But even here, gratitude does not rise to the surface. Grief and gratitude often walk hand in hand. We miss what we are thankful for, but in George's mourning we feel loss without reverence, pain without reflection. It's not that Fred and George were bad people. They were brave, loyal, daring. Their departure from Hogwarts during Umbridge's reign was one of the most iconic scenes in the series. It was rebellion with purpose. But rebellion alone is not virtue. In a world where people like Dobby die for friendship, where Lupin apologizes for abandoning his child, where even Snape reveals layers of buried loyalty, Fred and George stand apart, untouched by the same vulnerability. Number 18. They ignore the morality of their inventions. In the dimly lit corridors of Hogwarts, pranks were a common language, and none spoke it more fluently than Fred and George Weasley. They were legends, not just among the Gryffindors, but school-wide. Their mischief was sharp, clever, and often hilarious. But hidden beneath the laughter was a darker truth few dared to explore. The twins, in their brilliance, had become something far more dangerous than jokers. They had become inventors of chaos, ignoring the ethical consequences of their magical creations. It began innocently enough. Skiving snack boxes, a line of treats that made students instantly sick, were marketed with bright colors and cheeky descriptions. A nosebleed nougat could give someone a gushing nosebleed, while a fever fudge left the victim sweating and pale. "They work like a charm," said Fred proudly to Lee Jordan in Order of the Phoenix, "just long enough to get you out of class." But what if the prank went too far? What if a student had an underlying illness? or reacted badly to the concoction. The possibility never seemed to cross the twins' minds. Then there were the decoy detonators, small black orbs that once dropped scuttled away and exploded into smoke and noise. They were brilliant in design, used later even by the Order of the Phoenix. But in the hands of a less scrupulous person, they were perfect tools for distraction, theft, or worse. The twins marketed them without discrimination, and anyone who could pay the price walked away with a miniature riot in their pocket. The twins' disregard for consequences reached a peak when they introduced their patented daydream charms. These weren't mere jokes, they were magical hallucinations, immersive and seductive. A single spell plunged the user into a 30-minute fantasy world. "You know poo may be our best-selling item," Fred boasted, "but the daydream charms are my personal favorite." Yet these charms played with the mind. What if a student used one during a lesson on defensive spells and missed a vital concept? What if someone used it to escape from reality entirely? The Weasleys offered no guidance, no caution, just salesmanship. Their shop, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, opened in Diagon Alley with a fanfare of fireworks, jokes, and flashing neon colors. But among the shelves of punching telescopes and puking pastilles, danger lingered. Fainting fancies could render someone unconscious in seconds. "That's the idea," George laughed, demonstrating it on an unwitting customer who slumped to the floor. In another world and outside the security of jokes, this would be considered assault. And yet it's sold like hotcakes. Take, for instance, the canary creams, biscuits that temporarily turned the eater into a giant, flapping canary. Funny? Yes. Harmless? Not always. During their school years, they used them on unsuspecting first years who flailed and screamed, unaware of what was happening to their bodies. It was transformation magic, a complex and potentially dangerous branch reduced to slapstick without consent. No warnings, no ethics, just feathers. Dolores Umbridge was perhaps the first adult to realize the threat they posed. While her reign at Hogwarts was cruel and oppressive, the twins' rebellion culminated in mayhem, fireworks exploding in classrooms, swampy corridors, students cheering chaos. "Give her hell from us, Peeves," Fred shouted as they departed. And though many readers cheered, it was clear that the twins' inventions had become weapons of anarchy, not resistance. Fred and George never questioned their customers. Among their clientele were Slytherins, known for using any magical edge to torment others. What if Draco Malfoy had bought a fainting fancy and slipped it into Neville's food? What if a decoy detonator was used to stage a theft at Gringotts? Their products had no safeguards, no moral clause. They operated on profit and novelty, not responsibility. Even their joke wands, seemingly harmless at first, held sinister potential. Designed to turn into rubber chickens or squirt ink unexpectedly, they were later upgraded with more violent effects. One turned into a snake. Another exploded in sparks. In Half-Blood Prince, Ron recalls a wand that backfired so badly it burned off someone's eyebrows. Only meant for laughs, Fred would argue. But magic, even in jest, has consequences. George lost an ear in the Battle of the Seven Potters, a brutal reminder that magic is not always fun and games. One might wonder, in that quiet, painful moment, whether he reflected on all the toys and tricks he'd unleashed into the world. But no such reflection is shown. Instead, even in grief, the twins return to their craft, their humour becoming a shield against introspection. Their mother, Molly Weasley, was often horrified. She once shouted, "You could have blown your fingers off," when they tested a new product at home. But her protests were drowned out by fireworks and fanfare. To Fred and George, her concern was just more adult noise to be ignored. They weren't malicious, they simply didn't care to think beyond the joke. Even during the Second Wizarding War, the Weasley twins continued selling their goods. Some of it aided the resistance, yes, but the same products were still accessible to civilians, to children, to anyone with coin. In a world tearing itself apart, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes remained open, still pushing skiving snack boxes and wildfire whiz-bangs. They saw themselves as a light in dark times, but light can also blind. Their shield hats, a rare moment of practical genius, some were originally invented as a prank. George admitted this in Order of the Phoenix. We made them as a joke. Turned out they actually repel minor hexes. Useful, yes. But what does it say that even their most valuable invention began with no intent to protect, only to provoke? When Hogwarts reopened under Snape's regime, the shop's wares were smuggled in by loyal students. Items like the portable swamp became acts of defiance. But even then, the question lingered. Had Fred and George created weapons without realizing it? Or worse, had they known and just didn't care? The ethics of magical invention were never taught at Hogwarts. No curriculum warned students about the psychological effects of daydream charms or the addictive joy of manipulating reality. And the twins, who might have taught such lessons, were too busy designing products that blurred the line between joke and jinx. Number 19, they don't develop as characters. Fred and George Weasley are without a doubt two of the most beloved characters in the Harry Potter universe. Their charm lies in their humor, mischief, and boundless energy. From the moment they appear in the Philosopher's Stone, mocking Percy and stealing Ron's nose in the middle of King's Cross Station, they capture our attention. Yet, despite their popularity, their character arcs remain strikingly flat. Unlike others who mature, evolve, or undergo meaningful change, Fred and George seem immune to the passage of time or the weight of experience. They remain at their core the same pranksters from beginning to end. Take a moment to compare them to Neville Longbottom. When we meet Neville, he is forgetful, timid, and clumsy. But as the series progresses, he becomes one of the bravest students at Hogwarts. He stands up to Voldemort, leads the DA in Harry's absence, and even destroys the final Horcrux by killing Nagini. He grows not just in courage, but in complexity and self-awareness. Fred and George, on the other hand, appear untouched by the war, by loss, or even by their own close brushes with danger. Their jokes are the same. Their antics continue. Their understanding of the world never deepens. Even Draco Malfoy, often cast as a spoiled and petty antagonist, reveals deeper layers by the final books. In Half-Blood Prince, we see Draco trembling in the bathroom, unable to complete his task of killing Dumbledore. "I have to do this," he says, eyes brimming with fear. He is a boy burdened by impossible choices, and through him we glimpse the cost of war on the young. But with Fred and George there is no such reckoning. Their defiance remains theatrical, their rebellion more about fireworks than philosophy. It's true that Fred and George open their own business, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. This move is often hailed as their moment of growth. And yes, it is an impressive act of independence. They reject the traditional path of ministry employment and instead embrace entrepreneurship. But even in this, their development is superficial. Their shop is not a result of internal transformation. It is simply an extension of their schoolboy mischief. The products they sell, skiving snack boxes, decoy detonators, and Peruvian instant darkness powder, are clever, but their use of magic remains playful, not profound. Their business lacks any real evolution of identity. In Order of the Phoenix, when they storm out of Hogwarts, unleashing a dragon made of fireworks and leaving Umbridge to clean up the chaos, it's exhilarating. "Give her hell from us, Peeves," Fred calls as they vanish into legend. It's a cinematic moment, certainly, but what does it say about them as people? They escape rather than confront. They entertain rather than reflect. They refuse to engage with the moral complexity around them. Their rebellion is exciting but not transformative. Contrast this with Percy Weasley, who betrays his family in pursuit of career ambition but eventually returns, humbled and broken, to fight alongside them at the Battle of Hogwarts. Percy, often mocked, becomes more human through his failures. He learns, he regrets. When he weeps over Fred's body, we witness his full circle journey. Percy was shaking his brother and Ron was kneeling beside them. The moment is tragic, but earned. With Fred, there is no similar moment of reckoning. His death, while devastating, does not conclude a journey. It interrupts a loop. Even Ron, often accused of being comic relief himself, undergoes considerable growth. He battles jealousy, insecurity, and fear. He abandons Harry and Hermione in Deathly Hallows, only to return, deeply changed, understanding at last the weight of loyalty. His growth is messy and imperfect, but it's there. Fred and George never face such emotional confrontations. Their relationship with others is static. Their worldview is unchallenged. There is no shortage of opportunities for growth. They live through the rise of Voldemort, the death of Cedric Diggory, the torture of students at Hogwarts, and the murder of their own brother. But through it all, they remain unchanged. In Deathly Hallows, while Hogwarts is under siege and children are being whipped by Carrow siblings, Fred and George still appear with the same smiles, the same jokes. They never ask what it means to fight or why they fight. Their resistance is brave, yes, but shallow. Perhaps the most telling example is their reaction to the Triwizard Tournament. When Harry is selected, despite being underage, everyone is confused, some suspicious. Fred and George, however, use the moment to further their own agenda, attempting to enter themselves by tricking the age line. When their plan backfires, they emerge with long white beards and they laugh. They never ask why Harry might be terrified. They never wonder what darker magic might be at work. For them, it's just another joke. Hermione Granger, who could have easily remained a one-note overachiever, becomes a symbol of compassion and justice. She creates SPEW, she fights for elf rights, she becomes a war strategist. She questions authority, questions Dumbledore, even questions Harry. Fred and George never question anything, not themselves, not their choices, not even their role in a world that's rapidly collapsing. Some might argue that the twins represent constancy, a light in the dark, but constancy is not the same as stagnation. Luna Lovegood remains quirky and dreamlike, but she also becomes a fierce fighter. Her beliefs are tested, her loyalty proven. She is still Luna, but deeper, wiser. Fred and George, meanwhile, remain as they were in year one, brilliant, loud and shallow. There's a missed opportunity in the aftermath of the joke shop's success. The war intensifies, friends disappear, the ministry falls, yet the shop continues as though in another world. Where is the moment when George wonders if their inventions could be used for more than mischief? Where is the scene where Fred reflects on the consequences of their actions? When they sneak into Umbridge's office or distribute magical fireworks, it's always fun, but never thoughtful. Even their relationship with their family is underexplored. Molly Weasley is fiercely protective, and yet we never see a genuine confrontation, no argument about dropping out of school, no heartfelt reconciliation, no exploration of how their wildness affects the family. When Bill is attacked, when Ginny is kidnapped in Chamber of Secrets, when Arthur is bitten by Nagini, Fred and George remain oddly untouched. Their world does not expand. The death of Fred is one of the most painful moments in the series. It should have been the culmination of a deep emotional arc. But instead it feels like a senseless tragedy. Not because death is senseless, but because the character had no arc to complete. And that's the one that hurts the most, Rowling once said, because Fred was never supposed to die. And yet perhaps that's the problem. Fred was never supposed to change either. He died the same boy who dropped dung bombs in the Hogwarts corridors. George, in his grief, is given little voice. The twin bond so emphasized throughout is not explored in Mourning. We do not see him broken. We do not see him rebuild. We're told he names his son after Fred, but what does that mean to a man who lost half his soul? The tragedy is there, but never unpacked. It remains a headline, not a story. The Battle of Hogwarts, in all its horror and triumph, changes everyone. Lavender dies. Tonks and Lupin fall. Harry faces death. But Fred? Fred is laughing at a joke when he dies. The irony is cruel. He dies as he lived, unaware of the gravity around him. There is no final reflection, no resolution, no last truth. Throughout the series, characters are allowed to contradict themselves, to fail, to question. Even Dumbledore, the wise mentor, confesses his mistakes. "I cared more for your happiness than your knowing the truth," he tells Harry. This self-awareness is absent in Fred and George. They are frozen in time, eternal pranksters, untouched by consequence. This is not a failure of character, but a failure of development. Fred and George are full of potential. Their wit, intelligence, and charisma could have carried them through a profound arc, one that transformed mischief into meaning. Instead, they are denied that chance. They remain background sparks in a sky full of evolving stars. Number 20, they mock those who don't fit in. In the heart of Hogwarts, where secrets whispered through enchanted walls and laughter echoed across moving staircases, Fred and George Weasley reigned as the undisputed kings of mischief. Their jokes were legendary, their timing impeccable, and their charm disarming. But beneath the glittering surface of their pranks, something darker sometimes stirred. In their pursuit of laughter, they occasionally chose their targets not from among the powerful or cruel, but from those already on the margins, those who struggled to fit in. Take Percy Weasley, for instance, their own brother. Percy, who clung to rules like a life raft, desperate to prove himself in a world where brilliance was expected but rarely acknowledged, unless it came wrapped in rebellion. Fred and George mocked him relentlessly. "Hello, Percy," Fred would say with exaggerated pomp. "How's the cauldron bottom thickness regulation these days?" George would add with a wink, "We were just talking about how the ministry needs more people like you. You know, insufferable know-it-alls who tattle on their own family." The laughter would roll, often at Percy's expense. Percy, with his stiff posture and too tight smile, would flush red but say nothing. The barbs had already landed. Then there was Hermione Granger, brilliant, brave, endlessly loyal. But for Fred and George, she was often the punchline. "Honestly, you'd think she'd swallowed the library," Fred muttered once after Hermione corrected Ron's spell work. George laughed, adding, "No, worse, I think the library swallowed her." At first glance, it's harmless, just teasing. But there's a line between play and cruelty, and they flirted with it often. Hermione, a Muggle-born girl in a magical world, already had to fight for respect. Her intelligence was her armor. When Fred and George reduced that to a joke, they chipped away at something essential. Her dignity. Luna Lovegood was perhaps the most vulnerable. Eccentric, dreamy, and completely unbothered by what others thought, Luna was a soft target for sharp tongues. Fred and George weren't openly cruel. No hexes, no stolen shoes. But the mockery was there, subtle and biting. "Watch out," Fred once whispered dramatically as Luna walked by. "Raxpert steal your thoughts when you least expect it." George joined in, pretending to check his own ears. "Too late for me, I reckon." The others laughed. Luna did not. These moments reveal a truth not often discussed. Fred and George were not just schoolboy pranksters, they were wielders of social power. In the grand social economy of Hogwarts, humor could be currency or a weapon. and they knew how to use both. Their humour lifted some but wounded others, and more often than not those wounds were inflicted on people already struggling to belong. When Percy stood his ground, defending his commitment to the ministry, Fred and George didn't debate. They derided. When Hermione buried herself in books, seeking excellence, they mocked. When Luna spoke of creatures no one else believed in, they snickered. These weren't moments of equal sparring. They were moments where two charismatic boys punched down, and the crowd loved them for it. It's easy to love Fred and George. They're brave, funny, and unforgettable. But to love them fully is to see them clearly. Their legacy includes not just fireworks and joke shops, but laughter that sometimes came at the wrong person's expense. Their charm makes us forget that. In Order of the Phoenix, when Hermione takes charge of Dumbledore's army, she proves herself a leader. But Fred and George rarely treat her with respect. They follow Harry without question, but mock Hermione's precision and planning. "You'd think she was setting up a ministry branch," George mutters, when Hermione insists on organization. Hermione, undeterred, continues. But the smirk lingers. What's more telling is how they treat Neville Longbottom. Neville, who stammers and fumbles, who struggles with confidence, is rarely the target. Not because they respected him, but perhaps because he didn't matter enough. But when he joins Dumbledore's army and begins to change, Fred is quick to joke. "Blimey, Neville, you're turning into Mad-Eye Jr." George adds, "Careful, or we'll have to start calling you Fearsome Longbottom." It's a compliment wrapped in mockery, and Neville, unused to praise, doesn't know how to respond. This pattern repeats. In Goblet of Fire, when Hermione advocates for house elf rights, they scoff. "You've got to be joking, Hermione," Fred says. "You're not still on about spew, are you?" The way he says SPEW, with exaggerated syllables and a smirk, drains the seriousness from her cause. George chuckles. Next thing you know, she'll be knitting socks for trolls. The room laughs. Hermione does not. And yet the boys are not villains. Their mischief is not rooted in hatred, but that's precisely the danger. Harm disguised as humour, cruelty wrapped in charm. It's the kind of behaviour that goes unchallenged because it's entertaining, because it makes others laugh, because the targets, the Percys, Hermiones, Lunas, are the ones people already see as too much, too odd, or too uptight. In Philosopher's Stone, when Ron nervously explains that his rat is old and boring, Fred doesn't offer comfort. He pulls the rat's tail and jokes, "Maybe we can charm him into a ferret, at least then he'd be useful." It's funny, to everyone except Ron. But Ron, being younger, says nothing. He's used to it. Even within their own family, Fred and George built their humour on fragile backs. When they mock, they do it with smiles. That's the trick. It's always said with a grin, a twinkle, a wink. But laughter at someone's expense can leave wounds that smiles cannot erase. In Half-Blood Prince, when Percy visits home and tries to make amends, Fred and George are cold, scornful. "Come to borrow Mum's knitting patterns?" George asks. Percy falters. He is not forgiven. Their brother, their own blood, remains a punchline, and yet there are moments of redemption. In Deathly Hallows, when they fight for Hogwarts, they stand beside the very people they once mocked. George watches as Luna races into battle. Fred dies fighting for the castle where he once teased Hermione. There's growth, but not all stories get the time to heal. The tragedy of Fred's death is magnified by the layers he never shed. He died a hero, but he also died a boy who never fully reckoned with the hurt he caused. And George, forever altered, must live with both the absence of his twin and the echoes of their shared missteps. In the end, it's not about condemnation, it's about clarity. To remember Fred and George only as jokers is to flatten their story. They were brilliant, but also blind. They made people laugh, but sometimes made others cry. Real bravery isn't in making others laugh, it's in standing up for those who are laughed at. That was Hermione's strength, that was Luna's light. Fred and George had courage. But kindness, quiet and uncelebrated, is its own kind of magic, one they didn't always possess. Their legacy includes Weasley's wizard wheezes, fireworks over Umbridge's rule, and jokes that turned war into something survivable. But it also includes whispers behind backs, jokes made at the wrong moments, and friends who smiled through the sting. Hogwarts was full of ghosts, not just of people but of moments unspoken, of laughter that silenced voices, of boys who meant well but did wrong. Fred and George were not villains, but they were not saints either. To love them is to love them entirely, flaws and all. To recognize that sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't a curse or a hex, but a joke made at the expense of someone who has already learned to stay quiet. And perhaps that's the story we should remember, not just the one where fireworks lit up the sky, but the one where the quiet ones kept walking through the smoke, heads high, pretending it didn't hurt. Because sometimes the hardest magic of all is kindness, especially when no one else is watching. Number 21. Their rebellion against Umbridge hurt others. It was an explosion of light, chaos, and rebellion. The moment Fred and George Weasley ignited their fireworks and let them loose upon the polished corridors of Hogwarts, time seemed to pause. Students cheered, eyes wide with wonder, as Catherine wheels and zipped through classrooms, whistling past the stunned faces of professors. A dragon of fire roared overhead, leaving behind trails of smoke and joy. Dolores Umbridge stood aghast, powerless against the unrelenting storm the twins had unleashed. It was a spectacle worthy of every whisper of rebellion that had bubbled beneath the surface for months. But amid the dazzling magic and triumphant roars, something quieter happened, something no one wanted to talk about. The school began to break. In the days following the fireworks, the school seemed at first alive with renewed energy. Students praised Fred and George's boldness, calling them legends, heroes, visionaries. But the air, so thick with excitement, quickly turned sour. With every explosion came tighter restrictions. Umbridge, wounded in pride and authority, lashed out with vengeance. Her detentions multiplied. Her inspections grew more invasive. Students were dragged from hallways for smirking. Owls flew in terror, intercepted mid-flight for carrying notes. What began as a show of freedom became a tightening noose, and the twins were no longer there to pull it loose. The swamp, so gloriously conjured in the East Wing corridor, was left in place, half a joke, half a warning. "It is a swamp," McGonagall had muttered when Umbridge demanded its removal. "It will remove itself when it is good and ready." But the truth was, even the staff had no clear idea how to dismantle it. The magic was complex, the spellwork brilliant, and no student dared cross it unless they wanted to be sucked knee-deep into the muck. The entire wing was cut off for weeks. Students with classes nearby were forced to take long detours, losing precious minutes and patience. It was an inconvenience to most, a hazard to others, and to the first years who had to wade through it by accident, it was a nightmare. Professor Flitwick, whose patience usually never wavered, found himself on the verge of snapping. "This is not what I taught them," he whispered to Sprout one morning after a charms class had to be held outdoors because the swamp had begun emitting foul, unpredictable sounds. Sprout nodded solemnly. "They meant well," she said, "but intent is no excuse for carelessness." Even the staff, who harboured no love for Umbridge, had to admit the twins had gone too far. Not because they had defied authority, but because they had done so without considering the aftermath. One of the most painful consequences fell on the younger students. Dennis Creevey, still small for his age, and always trying to keep up with his older brother Colin, had tripped running away from a rogue firework that had veered into the stairwell 3 days after the initial display. It burned his sleeve and singed his hair. Madame Pomfrey was furious. "Stupidity disguised as bravery," she said through clenched teeth as she applied a cooling salve. Colin sat beside Dennis's bed, guilt-stricken. "They said they'd handle everything," he muttered. "They promised us it would be fun." The fun didn't last. For the rest of the term, Umbridge ruled like never before. The inquisitorial squad was emboldened, their power unchecked. Draco Malfoy walked the halls with a gleam in his eye and the authority of a prefect on a warpath. "So the Weasleys left us their mess to clean up," he sneered one afternoon to Hermione. "How very Gryffindor of them." Hermione bit back her retort. Even she, a staunch supporter of resistance, could not deny the truth buried in Malfoy's taunt. When Harry tried to talk about it, just once, Ron shut him down. "They did what they had to do," he snapped. "Better than sitting on our hands." But even Ron, in his quietest moments, wondered if his brothers had acted too soon, too rashly. They had always been showmen first, warriors second. Their rebellion, as brilliant as it was, had no follow-up. No plan for those left behind, no warning to those who had to pick up the pieces. The DA meetings had to be cancelled. With the castle now crawling with eyes and ears, and with Umbridge more paranoid than ever, even secret gatherings became nearly impossible. "They made her dangerous," Neville whispered one night in the common room. "Not just cruel, dangerous." He had a fresh scar on his cheek from detention, a punishment for being caught with a fake galleon, the very tool Fred and George had helped enchant. Angelina Johnson, Quidditch captain and known for her iron nerves, lost her temper during practice one stormy afternoon. "They left, damn it!" she shouted when Katie Bell missed a pass. "They left us to deal with this hellhole." Her voice cracked mid-word. Everyone fell silent. No one dared argue. They all knew she was right. In the absence of the twins, the school had grown darker, heavier, lonelier. Even Peeves, who had taken their parting instructions, "Give her hell from us," to heart, seemed to cause more trouble than triumph. His pranks, once mischievous, became mean-spirited. He flooded bathrooms, locked first years in closets, and nearly knocked out Professor Trelawney with a floating chalkboard. The line between rebellion and cruelty blurred dangerously, and without Fred and George to steer the chaos, it spun out of control. Minerva McGonagall, usually unshakable, found herself at odds with Dumbledore's silence. "Surely we must intervene," she said one night in his office. "This climate is untenable." Dumbledore looked weary. "Dolores has the Ministry's backing," he said quietly, "and our hands, for now, are tied." McGonagall stared at him. "And what of the students?" she asked. "Who unties their hands?" Luna Lovegood wandered through the mayhem with her usual dreamy detachment, but even she noticed the difference. "It's all so loud now," she said one morning to Ginny. "Not the fun kind of loud, the kind that makes your bones hum in the wrong way." Ginny nodded. She had been watching the swamp grow mossy near the library. Even chaos, it seemed, could rot when left too long unattended. The library itself became a haven, not for study, but for silence. Students retreated into its corners to escape the noise, the punishments, the surveillance. Madame Pint said nothing when they cried quietly behind bookshelves. "They just want peace," she told Professor Binns, who barely listened. But she knew what Fred and George had stirred wasn't rebellion, it was war. And war always had casualties. Some of the teachers, like Hagrid, continued to sing the twins' praises. "They did what needed doing," he told Harry one evening. "She had it coming." But even Hagrid couldn't ignore the tension in the air. His care of magical creatures class attendance dropped. Students were too scared to be caught outside in unapproved areas. "It's like walking through a spider's web every time you leave class," he said grimly. The truth is, Fred and George had lit a match in a room full of kindling. They didn't stay to see the fire burn, nor did they help to contain it. Their exit on broomsticks, grand and poetic, left behind confusion and vulnerability. It was like watching a dream fly away, Dean Thomas later said, and waking up in a nightmare. The dream was freedom, the nightmare was the price. "You're next," Umbridge had whispered to Parvati Patil after catching her giggling near the swamp. That was the new mood of Hogwarts, fear wrapped in pink bows. No one felt safe. The rebellion had stirred something inside her too. She was no longer just an agent of the Ministry. She became a force of vengeance, of humiliation, one that fed off defiance and turned it into a tool of control. The irony, of course, was that the Weasleys' greatest act of defiance gave Umbridge her greatest excuse. "Anarchy," she cried at every staff meeting. "Anarchy must be crushed." She didn't care who had thrown the fireworks. To her, every student was now a suspect, every smile a threat. And with the twins gone, no one had the courage or the flair to challenge her directly. Years later, students would remember the chaos with a mix of awe and sorrow. They would say, "Do you remember the fireworks, the swamp, the brooms?" And someone, always quieter, would add, "Do you remember the fear?" Because behind every spark was a shadow. Behind every laugh was a scream that never made it to the surface. Even Fred and George, in their later interviews at Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, would admit they hadn't considered the fallout. "We were just sick of it," George once said, "of her face, of her voice, of how everyone walked like they were afraid of their own shadows." Fred had nodded. "We wanted to give them hope. Maybe we forgot they needed protection too." So the rebellion was both triumph and tragedy. It was bold, unforgettable, inspiring, and terribly incomplete. They set the stage on fire but left before the curtains fell, and those left behind, they were the ones who had to walk through the ashes. As Hermione once said long after the war was over, rebellion must be more than fire and flash. It must be built to last. Number 22, they avoided real responsibility. Fred and George Weasley were always the jesters of the wizarding world, the bringers of laughter in dark times. But behind their fireworks and skiving snack boxes, behind the glitter of joke shops and the booming success of Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, lies a more uncomfortable truth. When the wizarding world was on the brink of collapse, when fear gripped the streets and Voldemort's name caused silences in conversation, Fred and George chose laughter, not war. They chose business, not battle. And while they were never cowards, they were also never truly on the front lines. When Voldemort returned and the Second Wizarding War began to take shape, members of the Weasley family made clear choices. Bill joined the Order of the Phoenix and risked his life repeatedly. Charlie remained in Romania but supported the Order from afar. Even Percy, estranged and foolish, found his way back to the family and the fight. Ron was only 17 when he stepped into mortal danger, hunting Horcruxes with Harry and Hermione. But Fred and George, they opened a joke shop in Diagon Alley. Amid whispers of death and despair, they painted their windows with jokes and potions, selling canary creams and fever fudge. The world burned, and they sold laughter. Of course, their shop wasn't meaningless. Some of their inventions had genuine value. Extendable ears were used for eavesdropping on Death Eater plans. Shield hats and protective cloaks were purchased by Ministry officials, and even members of the Order found practical uses for the twins' eccentric creations. But they were never tools of revolution, just clever commodities. Their work supported the fight, but from the safety of commerce. As Molly Weasley once said, "It's not just pranks anymore, boys. People are dying out there." Her voice, trembling with maternal worry, carried the weight of those unspoken fears. They weren't absent. That must be said. Fred and George were present at critical moments, the Battle of the Department of Mysteries, for instance. They fought alongside Dumbledore's army and held their ground when Death Eaters ambushed Hogwarts students. Fred was in the Battle of Hogwarts, and he paid the ultimate price for his bravery. But even these moments, filled with courage, feel almost accidental. Their lives were never built around the war. They were swept into it because it eventually came to their doorstep. Their departure from Hogwarts in Order of the Phoenix was iconic. Riding broomsticks into the sky, setting off fireworks and causing Peeves to salute them. It was a moment of rebellion, of flair, of youthful defiance. "Give her hell from us, Peeves," George shouted as they vanished into the night. It was bold, unforgettable, and yet it was also an escape. While the other members of Dumbledore's army stayed, facing the wrath of Dolores Umbridge and the tightening grip of tyranny, Fred and George left. They didn't stay to fight the regime from within. They left to start a business. Some might call that bravery in its own form, choosing hope, choosing joy, choosing to keep spirits high while others fought. But was it courage, or was it avoidance? When Neville Longbottom stood bloodied and broken, refusing to bow to Voldemort, that was courage. When Luna Lovegood was abducted by Death Eaters and still held on to her sanity and spirit, that was courage. Fred and George, for all their charm and inventiveness, never truly took on the mantle of leadership, of resistance. They offered help, but from the wings of the stage, not its centre. Take, for example, their involvement with Dumbledore's army. While enthusiastic participants, they were not its founders nor its strategists. That honour went to Harry, Hermione and Ron. Fred and George contributed, but they never led. Even in their own shop, they joked about the war more than they acknowledged its horrors. They sold products that mocked the ministry, but rarely confronted it directly. The resistance for them was a business opportunity. Contrast this with Ginny Weasley, younger than the twins, but fiercely involved. She battled Death Eaters in the Department of Mysteries and became one of the leaders of the resistance within Hogwarts when the Carrows took over. She faced torture, punishment, and isolation, but never backed down. Meanwhile, Fred and George kept the shop running, hiding from the ministry under the guise of providing comic relief. The world was collapsing, and they remained behind a counter. Andromeda Tonks, who lost her husband and daughter to the war, never had the luxury of running a shop. Neither did Kingsley Shacklebolt, who risked everything inside the ministry to leak information to the Order. Remus Lupin wandered in the shadows, a werewolf without a home, joining missions that could kill him. These were sacrifices, these were responsibilities. Fred and George, meanwhile, were described in Half-Blood Prince as having lines of customers for their wonder products, while their brother Ron was lying in a hospital bed after being poisoned. It's tempting to romanticize them. And indeed, their legacy is not without merit. Fred's death is a tragic reminder that war eventually finds us all. But even his final moments highlight this contrast. He died laughing at Percy's joke. Humour to the very end, yes, but also not in the thickest part of the battle. It was sudden, random, almost detached, a symbol perhaps of how they had always been adjacent to war, never fully in its grip. When Harry returns to the Burrow during the summer, he sees George working on the shop, even as the world grows darker. The shop is magical, impressive, even defiant in its brightness. But it is not a headquarters, it is not a sanctuary, it is commerce. And though Fred and George donate products and ideas to the resistance, their choices always remain calculated, helpful, but safe. They were not cowards, that must never be said, but courage in the wizarding world often means choosing to act even when the cost is unbearable. Tonks chose love despite the risk. Dobby chose freedom despite the consequence. Severus Snape, for all his moral ambiguities, put his life on the line daily for a cause that would never thank him. Fred and George chose success. They chose safety for their family, for their name. And maybe that was love in its own way, but it wasn't sacrifice. Molly and Arthur Weasley must have seen this too. Molly, ever the protector, likely understood why her sons stepped away from the battlefield. She had lost one son to estrangement. She didn't want to lose 2 more to war. Arthur, always supportive, might have seen value in joy during darkness, but still, there must have been moments where they wondered, why not more? Why not step forward like Bill, like Ron, like even Percy? At the end of Deathly Hallows, after the dust settles, George is left without his twin. Half a soul, half a heart. His grief is real, his pain unspoken. Perhaps then the war became real to him. Not a headline, not a whisper. Not a masked figure in the shadows, but a shattered body lying still on stone. Fred's absence, more than any speech or spell, became the reckoning. In Order of the Phoenix, Fred says, "You're joking, Percy. You actually are joking. I don't think I've heard you joke since you were—" He never finishes. Percy's betrayal of the family had caused wounds that only laughter could mend. And maybe that was the twins' secret role all along, to heal through humor, to fight despair with mischief. But roles evolve. And when the time came to step into true leadership, into the pain and fear of resistance, Fred and George hesitated. They created laughter in a time of tears. That is valuable, that is meaningful. But others created hope with blood. Others created change with loss. Fred and George chose not to wear the uniform of the Order. They chose not to carry out missions. They chose not to be symbols of resistance. They were entertainers, merchants, inventors. They were not warriors. Their avoidance of deeper responsibility speaks to something universal. Not everyone can fight, not everyone must. But in the story of heroes and villains, of battles and bravery, their role remains curiously undefined. Important, yes, beloved always, but not central, not transformative. And so we remember them with fondness and with questions. What more could they have done? What if they had led a branch of the resistance? What if their inventions had become weapons of war, not just items on shelves? What if they had stood where Harry stood, terrified, determined, alone? Would they have risen or fallen? We will never know. Fred's story ends too soon. George's continues, haunted. Their shop remains a colourful scar on the streets of Diagon Alley. But the legacy of responsibility, the true burden of choice and sacrifice, belongs to others, to the ones who walked into fire and didn't flinch, to the ones who carried the weight not of laughter, but of war. Number 23, they encouraged a culture of impunity. Fred and George Weasley never just broke the rules. They redefined the very concept of boundaries at Hogwarts. From their earliest years, the twins turned the corridors of the ancient castle into a stage where authority figures were comic foils, and mischief was a celebrated virtue. "Ask us no questions and we'll tell you no lies," Fred once said with a grin, a motto that summed up not just their worldview, but the subtle cultural shift they brought into the school. Unlike traditional troublemakers who operated in the shadows, Fred and George flaunted their defiance in the open, cloaking rebellion in charm and humor, and students, teachers, and even some adults followed their lead. They didn't simply challenge rules, they made a spectacle out of it. One of the earliest examples occurred in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. when they handed Harry the Marauder's map. The parchment, enchanted by previous mischief-makers, was a guide to every secret passage in the school. But it wasn't just the map, it was the way they passed it on. "We've decided you could do with a bit of help," George said casually. No warnings, no lectures, just an unspoken nod that rules were optional for those clever enough to circumvent them. In that moment, Harry wasn't just given a tool, he was inducted into a philosophy, and who wouldn't want to follow them? Fred and George had charisma, they had flair. More importantly, they had fun, something Hogwarts didn't always prioritize amid its rigid structure and deadly threats. To the younger students, they were legends. First years whispered stories of their fireworks, their enchanted candy, their explosive exits. Even Hermione, ever the advocate of order, couldn't always hide her reluctant amusement. But behind the laughter was a more insidious truth. By making rebellion glamorous, Fred and George laid the foundation for a culture of permissiveness that blurred the line between play and disrespect. Take, for example, their legendary swamp. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, faced with Dolores Umbridge's authoritarian rule, the twins executed their most famous prank, creating a massive swamp in a Hogwarts corridor. The timing was strategic, the message clear: resistance through spectacle. The swamp, which they refused to clean up even after McGonagall regained some control, was left there partly as a trophy. Even Flitwick, amused and impressed, preserved a corner of it. That was the genius and the danger. When pranks are praised by teachers, the boundary between rebellion and celebration disappears. And the truth is, not all teachers laughed. Severus Snape, often a target of their jokes, certainly didn't. He saw through the gloss, viewing the twins not just as pranksters, but as forces of chaos. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, he makes an offhand remark about their inexcusable behavior and the fact that they lacked discipline. Of course, Snape is rarely an objective narrator, but in this case he wasn't entirely wrong. The joke was always more important than the consequence, and that mindset, repeated over years, subtly taught students that order was secondary to amusement. That mindset became most dangerous when it trickled down. Lee Jordan, their closest friend, often accompanied them, narrating Quidditch matches with wild commentary that openly mocked teachers and opponents. "Jordan, if you can't commentate impartially," Professor McGonagall would interject, only to be drowned out by Lee's biased cheers for the Gryffindor team. The attitude was contagious. Peeves, the poltergeist, a long-standing emblem of chaos, found new energy in their presence. "Give her hell from us, Peeves!" Fred yelled, as they left Hogwarts in a blaze of fireworks and rebellion. Peeves saluted, and the rest of the school cheered. But what message did that send? That you can humiliate a professor and earn applause? That you can disrupt order as long as it's funny? The cultural impact was profound. Younger students stopped fearing punishment because Fred and George had made defiance into a performance. Humor became a shield. If people laughed, you were untouchable. The rules didn't apply to the clever or the charismatic. They applied only to the boring. It wasn't always harmless. During Umbridge's reign, the twins sold prank items that caused nosebleeds, vomiting, and fainting. These weren't just jokes. They were weapons. Their skiving snack boxes were used to skip class, undermining the authority of every teacher. "They make you ill," Ron explained with admiration. But only for a short while. In another context, distributing products that induced medical symptoms in minors would be considered unethical. But in Hogwarts, under the banner of Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, it was a triumph of ingenuity. The ends, escape, amusement, justified the means. One could argue that the twins were fighting a repressive regime. Umbridge was cruel, unfair, and often sadistic. But even before her arrival, Fred and George were already sowing seeds of non-compliance. They didn't need tyranny to justify their actions. Authority itself was their natural enemy. From using fake wands that turned into rubber chickens to charming snowballs to bounce off Quirrell's turban, which in hindsight meant they were pelting Voldemort in the face. They treated the school as their stage and the staff as straight men in their ongoing comedy. They also didn't encourage responsibility. When Ron was appointed a prefect in Order of the Phoenix, their reaction wasn't supportive. "What are we, Neville Longbottom?" Fred scoffed, implying that only the uncool would seek to enforce rules. And so another message was sent. If you support the system, you're boring, you're lesser. The brave are those who challenge the system, not through dialogue or protest, but through jokes, tricks, and disruption. Yet despite their antics, the twins were beloved. Molly Weasley scolded them, but with a mother's affectionate exasperation. Dumbledore, often the symbol of tolerance, never punished them harshly. In fact, when they flew out of the school on broomsticks during their grand exit, he was rumoured to be smiling. This was the ultimate endorsement. If even the headmaster could enjoy their rebellion, why shouldn't everyone? And so discipline eroded. Authority became the enemy. Humour, no matter how destructive, became a virtue. That atmosphere was dangerous, not just because it encouraged rule-breaking, but because it delegitimized rules entirely. In a place where trolls could enter the dungeons and death was a real risk, treating the structure as a joke was irresponsible. Hogwarts needed order, not just charm. This culture of permissiveness also affected interpersonal dynamics. Students who tried to follow rules were mocked. Hermione, for example, often clashed with the twins. In Goblet of Fire, when she challenged them about selling fake wands and other trick items, they laughed her off. But her concerns were real. What if a product malfunctioned? What if a younger student got hurt? The twins never addressed these questions. The laughter was always louder than logic. Even Percy Weasley, often ridiculed for his ambition and love of rules, saw the danger. In his estranged letter to Ron, he warned, Fred and George's attitude has always been a bit, well, lax. While Percy was certainly arrogant, his observation was rooted in truth. The twins didn't just push limits, they erased them. And not everyone was equipped to handle that kind of freedom. Not every student was a Fred or George. But many tried to be. And what of their legacy? After leaving Hogwarts, Fred and George opened their shop in Diagon Alley. A commercial success, yes, but also a temple to their philosophy. "Why are you worrying about you-know-who?" asked George. "You should be worrying about you-know-poo, the constipation sensation that's gripping the nation." In the darkest times, they preached distraction, levity, laughter, and while that brought comfort, it also risked minimizing the severity of the threat. When fear reigns, a joke is balm, but too many jokes, and the danger becomes a cartoon. Fred's death in Deathly Hallows brought a sobering end to their saga. It reminded everyone that even the jesters bleed, even the pranksters die. But by then the culture had changed. Their spirit lived on, not just in their products, but in the attitude they left behind. Rules were for the unimaginative, mischief was virtue, and if you were clever enough, charming enough, loud enough, you could get away with anything. That's not just mischief. That's systemic erosion, a slow, smiling unraveling of structure, responsibility, and accountability. And it all began with two boys who made everyone laugh, and who taught an entire generation that being funny was more important than being right. Number 24. They never took Ron seriously. Of all the shadows that haunted Ron Weasley's childhood, none clung more tightly than those cast by his older brothers, Fred and George. Twins, tricksters, and heroes to many, they lit up every room they entered with mischief and laughter. But for Ron, that same fire often burned. As the youngest boy in a sprawling family, he was already contending with towering expectations. And yet it wasn't Charlie's dragon taming or Bill's curse breaking that gnawed at his self-worth. It was Fred and George's jokes, their pranks, and most painfully, their refusal to ever truly take him seriously. Even as children, their games often turned Ron into the punchline. When Ron was barely 4 years old, Fred convinced him that gnomes in the garden were carnivorous and had taken a liking to red-headed boys. George, always ready to build the fantasy, left chicken bones scattered by the hedges. Ron cried for 2 days, and Molly, his mother, had to scold the twins. "They're just having a laugh, Ron," she said gently, brushing dirt from his cheeks. But to Ron it never felt funny. The years rolled on, and the jokes grew sharper. In Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, Ron's greatest fear came to life when he had to face a horde of giant spiders in the Forbidden Forest. But before that moment of terror, Fred and George had already laid the groundwork. "What's the worst that can happen? You'll get eaten?" George had laughed, tossing a handful of spider-shaped candies at Ron during dinner. Ron's face turned pale, and though everyone chuckled, he looked down at his plate and quietly pushed away his food. The twins loved to tease him about Scabbers, his pet rat, who was old, lazy, and unimpressive. "You sure he's not just a particularly ugly sock?" Fred had once joked during a summer morning at the Burrow. Ron, holding the rat tenderly, didn't respond. But that night he asked Percy in a whisper if it was true. Was Scabbers pathetic? Percy, distracted, just muttered, "You should get a new one," and turned away. Ron learned early on that he'd find no shield in his family. At Hogwarts, Fred and George's antics became legendary. They were adored by Gryffindor House, beloved for their cleverness and rebellion. But with every dung bomb they lobbed and every suit of armor they enchanted, Ron remained the little brother, the tag-along. In Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, when Ron briefly fell out with Harry due to the Triwizard Tournament, Fred and George were the first to roll their eyes at Ron's feelings. "Don't be thick, Ron. Of course he didn't put his name in," Fred had said, but his tone lacked compassion. It was dismissal, not comfort. They weren't cruel. That's the complicated truth. Fred and George never meant to harm Ron. Their jests were casual, their insults wrapped in humor, but the damage wasn't in what they intended. It was in how Ron internalized it. "Why is it always me?" he muttered more than once. In the Philosopher's Stone, during his first ride on the Hogwarts Express, he confessed to Harry, "Everyone expects me to do as well as the others, but if I do, it's no big deal, because they did it first." That wasn't about Percy or Bill. It was Fred and George who were the icons of coolness and boldness, who made him feel invisible. There was a moment, fleeting but sharp, during The Prisoner of Azkaban, when Ron broke his leg in the Shrieking Shack while defending Harry and Hermione. Fred and George, upon hearing the news, laughed that Ron probably tripped over his own feet. Hermione scowled at them, but again no one really corrected the twins. Their word was gospel. Their jokes always met with chuckles, never confrontation. What Ron wanted more than anything was to be taken seriously. To have someone, especially those he admired, look him in the eye and say, "You did well." Not because he was the youngest, or the underdog, or the comic relief, but because he deserved it. When he joined the Quidditch team in the Order of the Phoenix, Fred and George mocked him during practices. "Come on, Ronnikins, try not to fall off this time," Fred called out. Ron clenched his jaw and said nothing. The pressure grew so great that he began to dread games. After one particularly rough match, he sat alone in the changing room, his hands shaking, before Ginny quietly placed a butterbeer beside him and left without a word. There was tenderness in the twins, buried deep. But it rarely surfaced when it came to Ron. In The Half-Blood Prince, Fred and George opened their shop, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, a triumph of talent and business. Ron congratulated them, and for once, Fred paused. "Thanks, Ron," he said, almost sincerely. But then George added with a grin, "You're still not getting a discount." And just like that, the moment passed. Ron's insecurity wasn't born in a vacuum. It was fed over years by small dismissals, laughing glances, jokes whispered just loudly enough. He admired the twins. He wanted to be like them. He wanted to be brave, clever, and fearless. But they never let him forget that he was the baby brother, the one who still had to prove himself. There's a haunting line in the Deathly Hallows after Fred dies. George is shattered, broken in a way that no magic can fix. Ron stands nearby, pale and silent. There's no celebration in surviving, only the deep wound of loss. And perhaps in that moment, Ron's grief was compounded, not just by the death of a brother, but by the loss of someone he had spent his whole life hoping to impress. One can argue that Fred and George pushed Ron to be stronger, that their teasing was a twisted form of affection. But Ron never had the tools to understand it that way. In The Half-Blood Prince, Dumbledore says, "It is our choices that show what we truly are." Ron chose to stay loyal, to fight, to love, even when he doubted himself. He chose to keep going, despite feeling like the least extraordinary of them all. It wasn't that Fred and George hated him. They loved him in their way, but their love came laced with sarcasm, with jabs, with "don't be such a wimp, Ron." And that's what stung the most, because he didn't need jesters. He needed brothers. When Ron destroyed the locket Horcrux in the Deathly Hallows, the vision it showed him wasn't Voldemort. It was Harry and Hermione laughing, telling him he was nothing, always second best. That delusion wasn't born from Voldemort's imagination. It was built on years of being told, directly and indirectly, that he didn't quite measure up. The locket hissed, "Least loved, always the last." And Ron, with trembling hands, brought down the sword and shattered it. It was more than a Horcrux he killed that day. It was the shadow of every moment he was made to feel small. There are moments of redemption. George, after the war, speaks of Ron with admiration. "He saved the world, didn't he?" he says once, quietly, in a pub to Lee Jordan. And maybe, just maybe, that was something Fred never got to say, but might have if given the chance. Still, that validation came too late for the boy who once sat alone at the Burrows pond, skipping stones and wondering if anyone truly saw him. Even Ron's relationship with Hermione was shaped by this lingering self-doubt. He believed for years that she couldn't possibly love someone like him. Someone ordinary, someone mocked by his own family. Fred and George had often teased him about her too. "When's the wedding, Ronikins?" they would say, and Ron would flush scarlet and storm away, heart racing, afraid they might be right, afraid it was all a joke. And yet Ron did find his voice, slowly, painfully, beautifully. He became the strategist in the trio, the friend who stood by Harry even when the world called him a liar, the boy who broke into the ministry, who rode dragons, who came back after running away, not because he was perfect, but because he was brave. And it was a quiet bravery, the kind that needed no spotlight. Still, imagine how different his journey might have been if, just once, Fred or George had put a hand on his shoulder and said, "You're enough, Ron, just as you are." Imagine if, on that first train ride, instead of mocking him for his hand-me-downs, they had said, "You'll love it at Hogwarts. You'll do great." Those words cost nothing, but they can change a life. In the end, Ron's greatest victory wasn't in battle. It was in surviving the weight of comparison, in standing tall even when his brothers laughed, in learning after years of silence to love himself not for what he achieved, but for who he was, loyal, kind, imperfect, and real. And maybe that's why Ron Weasley matters. Not because he was the chosen one, or the brightest witch of his age, or the twin who made the world laugh, but because he wasn't. And still, he stayed. Still he fought. Still he mattered. Number 25, they could be cruel even to friends. Fred and George Weasley, the beloved pranksters of the wizarding world, were often seen as comic relief, those daring boys with a joke for every occasion and a firework for every rule. But behind the laughter and the roars of approval in the Gryffindor common room, there was a darker side to their mischief, a side that sometimes overlooked the feelings of even their closest companions. Because when the joke was cruel and the punchline stung, it was often excused with a careless, "Don't take it personally, it's just Fred and George being Fred and George." But what if that wasn't always okay? Take Hermione Granger, for example. Brilliant, bookish, and dedicated, she was often the subject of Fred and George's relentless teasing. Her love for the library became a running gag, her need to follow rules a punchline. "You know, George, I think our dear Hermione would marry a textbook if she could," Fred once joked loudly, prompting laughter from the surrounding students. George followed with, "Only if it had a chapter on elf rights." The jab, aimed at her passionate campaign for house elf liberation, drew snickers. But Hermione's face fell. No one asked her how it felt to be laughed at for caring about something deeply personal. They never quite knew where the line was, or perhaps they simply didn't care. Their relentless mockery of Percy Weasley, though more obviously harsh, was another example. Percy, pompous and rule-bound, may not have been the most sympathetic sibling, but he was still their brother. The twins called him Perfect Prefect Percy with such venomous sarcasm that even Ron once muttered, "That's a bit much, isn't it?" Percy, beneath all his bluster, was a lonely figure, mocked by his brothers, unappreciated by his peers. And Fred and George made him a target, not just in private, but in public, loudly, repeatedly. Neville Longbottom received no less humiliation. Sweet, shy Neville, who struggled with magic and confidence, was often reduced to comic fodder. Fred and George delighted in making him the butt of jokes, calling him the human cactus after an unfortunate herbology incident. "Blimey, Neville, even a flobberworm has more grace," George said, once during a Quidditch tryout. The words were meant to amuse, but they hit like hexes. Neville smiled weakly, the kind of smile people wear to hide a bruise, and sat quietly while others laughed at his expense. The incident with the Tun-Tung toffee was another example of their brand of humour going too far. They gave the candy to Dudley Dursley, a thoroughly unpleasant boy, yes, but the resulting chaos, with Dudley choking on a tongue that stretched several feet long, terrified his parents. While Fred and George laughed, Mr. Weasley had to plead with his wife not to report them to the ministry. It was a joke, they said, but it wasn't funny to the victim, nor to the adults who had to intervene. A joke that could end in injury is no harmless prank. In their final year at Hogwarts, Fred and George turned their sights on authority itself, and for once many applauded them. Their departure from the school in a blaze of fireworks and rebellion against Dolores Umbridge was legendary. But even in that triumphant moment there were casualties. First-year students were caught in the crossfire of wild spells and magical chaos. Peeves, given license to run riot, became more unmanageable than ever. The school descended into something that felt less like freedom and more like anarchy. And Fred and George, for all their brilliance, walked away from the mess with smirks and laughter. Even Ron, their own younger brother and someone they genuinely cared for, was not spared. When Ron became a prefect in his 5th year, Fred sneered. "That's everyone in the family," George added with mockery. "What are Fred and I, next-door neighbours?" Their ridicule made Ron self-conscious about his accomplishment, as if he had betrayed their image of rebellion by accepting a role of responsibility. The truth was that Ron wanted to make his parents proud, but his brothers turned his moment of pride into a joke. There was a particular moment in Order of the Phoenix that stood out. When Hermione suggested that Harry teach fellow students defense against the dark arts in secret, Fred and George, instead of focusing on the danger and importance of the idea, immediately jumped to comic possibilities. "Can we be called Dumbledore's Army of Darkness?" Fred quipped. Hermione rolled her eyes, but there was a pause in her voice. Not every moment was a chance for laughter, and not every serious suggestion needed a punchline. It's important to remember how young the trio was, Harry, Ron and Hermione, and how much pressure they carried. But Fred and George rarely gave them space to be vulnerable. When Harry was visibly suffering from nightmares and trauma after Cedric's death, the twins would often distract with jokes. George said, "Maybe you've got seer blood in you, mate," after Harry mentioned his dreams. The intention might have been to lighten the mood, but sometimes jokes feel like avoidance, a refusal to acknowledge the pain beneath. The legacy of Fred and George's humour often depended on who you asked. To Lee Jordan, they were heroes, brave, clever, and hilarious. To students who adored rebellion, they were icons. But to others, especially the quiet ones, the oddballs, the rule followers, their jokes could feel like a sword cloaked in feathers. Soft-looking, but still sharp. Luna Lovegood, for instance, was an oddity even in the magical world. While Fred and George didn't target her directly, they didn't stand up for her either. And silence sometimes is a form of cruelty too. The moral authority of Dumbledore loomed over Hogwarts like a guardian shadow, but even he was lenient with Fred and George. Their mischief was treated with indulgence, perhaps too much indulgence. They were allowed to experiment with dangerous joke products, skiving snack boxes, Peruvian instant darkness powder, and no one asked what might happen if those fell into the wrong hands. It wasn't until they left the school that the real consequences of their actions became apparent. At their joke shop, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, they sold products that could incapacitate, confuse, and deceive. Impressive, yes. But where was the line between innovation and irresponsibility? A young boy bought a nosebleed nougat and ended up in St. Mungo's for a full day due to a rare reaction. Fred laughed. Well, that's one way to get out of a boring family dinner. But the boy's mother didn't laugh. She cried in the hospital waiting room, cradling her son's hand, wondering what kind of joke this was supposed to be. It's not that Fred and George were bad people, they weren't. They were loyal to their family, deeply brave, and in the end paid the ultimate price in the war against Voldemort. But even good people have blind spots, and humour, unchecked and unquestioned, can become a weapon. They were surrounded by laughter, but perhaps too rarely by honesty. No one ever told them, "That hurt." No one ever said, "This isn't funny anymore." There's a strange kind of power in being the funny one. People forgive you faster. They excuse your cruelty as wit. They let you get away with more because everyone wants to be around the person who makes them laugh. Fred and George wielded that power with brilliance, but not always with kindness. Sometimes their humour created distance rather than connection. Sometimes it left scars. Even in Deathly Hallows, during the darkest time, they couldn't resist mocking Percy when he returned to fight. Fred, just before his death, was joking with Percy about the most boring joke he's ever heard, finally accepting Percy's presence. But even that moment came wrapped in irony. Death was coming, and Fred never got to say a proper goodbye. maybe he would have said, "No hard feelings, Percy." Or maybe Percy, standing over Fred's lifeless body, realized too late how much was never spoken seriously. The war, in many ways, revealed the deeper truths of people. And for Fred and George, it showed both their courage and their limits. They gave everything, yes, but they also never truly learned how to be serious, until seriousness became unavoidable. George, after Fred's death, became quieter, more withdrawn. Perhaps for the first time he felt what it was like to be on the other side of silence, to know that some things cannot be laughed away. The sadness of Fred's death was not just in the loss of a brother or a twin, but the shattering of a dynamic that had defined Hogwarts for so many years. In George's grief, we saw the depth that had always been there, hidden beneath pranks and jokes. It made us wonder that if they had been taught earlier to temper humour with empathy, could they have been even more extraordinary? In the end, Fred and George were not villains, but they were not saints either. They were complex boys, raised in a noisy house full of love and competition, always trying to stand out, always trying to be noticed. And in that race for laughter, sometimes they stepped on others without noticing. Sometimes they left bruises masked as giggles. Their story is not a condemnation, but a reminder that kindness must always accompany humour, that friends deserve more than to be the punchline, that laughter should never be louder than love. And perhaps the greatest irony of all, the boys who brought so much joy to others left behind a grief so profound, even their own jokes couldn't ease it. Number 26. They used humour as a defence mechanism. Fred and George Weasley, the twin sparks of laughter in the dim corridors of Hogwarts, were always more than pranksters. From the moment they first appeared in Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, helping Harry with his trunk at King's Cross, they carried with them a sense of reckless joy. They laughed, they joked, they blew things up with glee. But beneath that brilliance was a deeper story, one written not with fireworks but with silence, the things they never said, and the emotions they never dared to show. Their humour, as dazzling and contagious as it was, served as a barrier, one that shielded not just themselves, but also the people around them from the raw, gnawing truth of fear, loss, and uncertainty. It's easy to see the twins as symbols of chaos and joy. After all, they founded Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, a shop filled with skiving snack boxes, puking pastilles, and extendable ears. They turned the rules of Hogwarts into a punchline and turned Umbridge's tyranny into a spectacle. When they flew off into the sky, leaving a blaze of magical fireworks behind them, it was nothing short of legendary. But in hindsight, especially for George, that moment is painfully ironic. That wild exit was their declaration of independence. It was the peak of their shared identity, and, unbeknownst to them, it was also the beginning of the end. Because how do you remain the same when your other half is no longer there to laugh beside you? Even during their Hogwarts years, the twins' humour served more than the purpose of entertainment. Consider the way they handled the constant financial pressure their family endured. The Weasleys were never well off. Ron's embarrassment about his hand-me-down robes and worn wand echoed a reality Fred and George were intimately familiar with. But unlike Ron, they never allowed anyone to see that it bothered them. Instead, they laughed it off, making fun of their own poverty before anyone else could. "We're not stupid. We know we're called Weasley and not Gringotts," Fred once said with a wink, brushing aside the very real sting of always being the family that had less. They used that same technique when dealing with danger. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, when the threat of Voldemort became all too real and the world began to crumble around them, Fred and George ramped up the pranks. They were never cruel, but they were disruptive, drawing attention away from fear. Their fireworks display and their portable swamp weren't just middle fingers to Umbridge, they were methods of breaking the mounting tension that pressed down on every student like an iron hand. Their antics brought light into a darkening world. But humour was also their way of avoiding the abyss. They didn't speak of fear, not during the rise of Voldemort, not when their father was nearly killed, not even when Percy, their own brother, broke from the family. When Molly cried, and Arthur tried to hold the family together with quiet patience, Fred and George doubled down on jokes. And when Ginny was taken into the Chamber of Secrets, their grief was masked by brave faces and reassuring grins. They never discussed what it meant to almost lose their sister. They simply made her laugh when she returned. In truth, it was always George who followed Fred's lead. Fred, the older by mere minutes, often spoke first, moved first, joked first. George was never far behind, a perfect reflection, not only in appearance but in timing and temperament. They were so in sync that even their speech blurred into one voice. But that closeness meant they shared not just joy, but also the burden of pretending. If one was afraid, the other couldn't show it. They kept each other strong, but only on the surface. The war forced cracks in that armor. When Bill was mauled by Greyback, the family sat in silent horror at his bedside. Yet even then, Fred said, he's still got his good looks, just needs to work on that hairy corpse thing. It was funny. It made Fleur smile, which helped Molly breathe, but it also hurt, because the pain was real and joking was the only language they knew for dealing with it. There's a moment in Deathly Hallows when the illusion begins to break. During the flight from Privet Drive, George loses an ear. A simple joke follows. Saint-like, he says. Holy. Everyone laughs, even in the blood-stained chaos, but for Fred, the sight of George wounded is a sobering punch to the gut. The text doesn't elaborate. Fred doesn't cry. He doesn't panic. But Rowling lets us feel the pause in him, the tremor beneath the smile. The joke lands, but the laughter is different now. There's fear underneath. It becomes unbearable to look back at Deathly Hallows knowing what's coming. Fred's death is sudden, merciless and cruel. There is no foreshadowing. He simply dies in an explosion while laughing, cut down mid-joke. And that's the last time we'll ever laugh together, George must have thought, because Fred didn't just die, he took half of George with him, and it's only then that the joke ends. Rowling doesn't spend many pages describing George's grief. She doesn't have to. In the epilogue, George lives. He marries. He raises a son he names Fred. But the absence lingers like a wound that never fully heals. In interviews, Rowling once said, George never truly gets over it. The joke that once protected him is gone. What good is laughter when the person who shared it with you is buried? This is the great tragedy of Fred and George Weasley. Their humour, which once lit up a room, became a shadow after the war. George returned to the joke shop. He ran it with Ron, but it wasn't the same. Ron, for all his love, didn't speak in sync, didn't crack the same kind of firecracker punchlines, didn't fill the air with that same mischievous electricity. The magic of the Weasley twins was never just the mischief, it was the togetherness. They were a duo like hands clapping or feet dancing. Alone, George was just one echo of a joke that once roared with laughter. We often think of humour as light, but for the Weasley twins it was armour. They used it to keep others safe. Ginny, Ron, even Harry. When Harry was consumed by the weight of prophecy and death, it was Fred and George who reminded him what joy was. When Sirius died and grief poured over Grimmauld Place like a flood, the twins cracked jokes about Creature. They didn't mock the pain, but they tried to make it bearable. Yet they themselves never unpacked that pain. There's no scene in the books where Fred admits to being scared. There's no moment where George breaks down. Instead, there are smiles, explosions, banter. That's how they survived. And perhaps that's why it hurt so deeply when Fred didn't. Fred and George's story is one of contrasts. They were the clowns in a world falling apart, the jesters in a castle under siege. But they were also young men raised in war, surrounded by loss. They knew what fear was, they just refused to speak its name. In Order of the Phoenix, when Harry has a nightmare and wakes screaming, it's not Fred or George who comes to comfort him. They don't know how, they never learned that language. All they can do is distract. There's something profoundly human in that. How many of us laugh to avoid crying? How many hide behind sarcasm when things feel too heavy? The twins, in all their brilliance, embodied that universal truth. Their jokes weren't lies, but they were shields. The brighter the joke, the deeper the pain it covered. And in Fred's final smile we see the cost. One of the most haunting moments comes not from the book, but from the aftermath. The way fans imagined George hearing something funny, laughing, and then realizing the echo is gone. That split-second pause, that silence, because it was never just a laugh, it was their laugh, and it died with Fred. Their legacy, though, remains. Weasley's wizard. Wheezes thrives. Children still buy joke wands. Fireworks still explode in the sky. And somewhere in Diagon Alley, a portrait of Fred probably hangs beside the counter, frozen mid-laugh. George wakes each day and continues. That, perhaps, is the bravest joke of all. In truth, the tragedy of Fred and George Weasley is not just in the death of one, it's in how they taught the world to laugh, even when they themselves were breaking. It's in how they wore smiles like armor and used jokes as swords. They were warriors, not with wands, but with joy. And behind every punchline was a story they never told, a pain they never voiced, but one we feel all the same. Number 27. They never tried to reconnect with Percy. Of all the complicated relationships in the Weasley family, the one that remained painfully unresolved was between Fred, George, and their older brother Percy. The twins, known for their charm, wit, and boundless creativity, never truly attempted to mend what had been broken. Percy, for all his flaws, was still their brother. Yet when he walked away from the family during the Second Wizarding War, choosing loyalty to the Ministry of Magic over his own blood, it was as if Fred and George crossed his name off the family tree without ever looking back. Their reaction to Percy's defection was predictable, at least on the surface. They laughed, they joked, they mocked. It became a running gag, our brother the Ministry drone, as if Percy's betrayal was just another punchline. But underneath that sarcasm there was never a moment where either Fred or George reached out. Not once did they pull Percy aside and ask, why? Or even more vulnerably, are you okay? They never gave him the benefit of the doubt, never sought understanding. It was easier to hide behind the humor, easier to call him names than to face the painful complexity of a brother turning away. Percy's departure was not a simple disagreement. It was a rift that tore through the Weasley household. Molly wept over it. Arthur sat in silence, trying to bridge the gap with quiet, fatherly wisdom. Even Bill and Charlie, living their lives elsewhere, tried to maintain a neutral ground. But Fred and George, they doubled down on the cruelty. In Order of the Phoenix, during a tense Christmas at Grimmauld Place, Percy's absence was felt like a missing limb. Yet even then, when the family gathered to open gifts, Fred had something to say. Wonder if Percy's enjoying his ministry-approved Christmas pudding. The room went quiet, but Fred just grinned. He always grinned. Perhaps part of their resentment stemmed from how Percy saw them. He never admired their joke shop dreams. To him, they were wasting potential, avoiding the path of ambition and structure he had so proudly chosen. In Goblet of Fire, Percy's words dripped with condescension. You two are still doing that nonsense with filibuster fireworks, are you? He saw their innovation as mischief, not genius. And maybe that hurt more than either Fred or George would admit. But rather than confront that pain, they made it a game. Percy was the fool, the ministry's puppet, the brother they didn't need. But beneath every joke there's a truth, and beneath every truth often a wound. When Percy stood by Fudge and denied Voldemort's return, when he sent back his Weasley jumper unopened that Christmas, that wound deepened. Still, Fred and George never made a move, not a letter, not a knock on his door. And when Percy finally returned, broken and shaking, it was not his brothers who welcomed him. It was their mother. "Mum, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." Percy sobbed into her arms during the Battle of Hogwarts, and Fred stood nearby, stunned. In Deathly Hallows, that moment of reconciliation wasn't theirs to claim. Fred didn't step forward. He didn't offer Percy a hand. Even in that final hour, as death circled overhead and the castle crumbled, Fred chose silence. The war had stolen so much from them already. And in the chaos of explosions and shattered stone, Percy fought side by side with Fred, but only then did they truly stand together. Just moments before Fred died, there was laughter. It was the only time the three had shared a real moment since Percy's estrangement. A single, fleeting second. And then it was gone. He was killed in an explosion, the book says simply. Just like that. Fred Weasley, half of the iconic duo, was gone. And what was left behind wasn't just grief, it was unfinished business. Percy fell to his knees beside him, screaming. The sound of it pierced the din of battle, and in that scream was everything unsaid, the apology, the forgiveness, the brotherhood that had been stolen by pride and silence. It's easy to paint Fred and George as heroes, and in many ways they were. They fought for what was right, they brought light to darkness, and their joke shop became a symbol of resistance. But even heroes fail. Their failure wasn't in battle, it was in the quiet moments when love required more than laughter. Percy may have lost his way, but Fred and George never tried to guide him back. They never gave him a reason to believe he still belonged. The brilliance of their fireworks couldn't light that path. After Fred's death, George was never the same. His jokes grew quieter. His eyes lost their mischief. He carried on Weasley's wizard wheezes alone, but something in him dimmed forever. One has to wonder, did he think of Percy in those moments? Did he regret not speaking, not trying, not reaching out when it mattered? Grief is a cruel mirror. It shows us everything we failed to do. And George, left without his twin and without peace, must have faced that reflection daily. In Half-Blood Prince, there's a brief line, easily missed, where Mrs. Weasley tells Harry, "I just wish Percy would come back to us." Fred and George had rolled their eyes. George muttered, "Good luck with that." But Harry had noticed the flicker of pain in their mother's expression. She hadn't given up, but her sons had, and when your family stops believing in you, it's easier to stay away. What makes this all the more tragic is how alike Fred, George, and Percy were beneath the surface. All three were deeply driven. All three wanted to prove themselves. Percy sought structure and recognition. Fred and George sought freedom and validation. But they all wanted to matter. They all wanted to be seen. If only they could have looked past the surface, they might have recognized that sameness and found a way back to each other. There's a haunting detail in the Deathly Hallows aftermath. Percy carried Fred's body away from the rubble. He did it alone. No words, no jokes, just silence and tears. He held the brother he had once abandoned, who had never forgiven him, and now never could. That image, the loyal, broken older brother cradling the life he didn't save, lingers longer than any spell or prophecy. It is the cost of silence, the price of pride. One might argue that Percy should have made the first move. After all, he left. He aligned himself with the enemy, but family doesn't work like that. Healing doesn't have a fixed direction. It takes both sides. And Fred and George, with all their charisma and cleverness, never gave that healing a chance. They could have used a prank to open a door. They could have sent him a letter with a joke and a sincere line at the end. But they didn't. They turned every possibility into another laugh, and in doing so, locked the door tighter. Fred and George were known for breaking rules. They broke out of Hogwarts. They defied Umbridge. They flew fireworks through the Great Hall. But they couldn't break through their own bitterness. That was the one rule they never dared to challenge, the unspoken vow that Percy didn't belong. It was cowardice disguised as comedy. And when Fred died, that unchallenged rule remained, carved deeper into the stone of loss. In a world filled with magic, it was this very human tragedy that stood out most. Not curses or horcruxes, but the failure to say, "I miss you." Not wands or potions, but the inability to forgive before it was too late. The war ended. The Dark Lord fell, peace returned, but Fred never came back. And the rift, though closed by death, had already stolen too much. George, left behind, lived with a hollow silence where Fred's voice used to be. But perhaps another silence haunted him more. The silence between laughter and forgiveness. The silence between him and Percy. The joke they never told, the truth they never faced, the hug that never happened. Maybe that was the cruelest punchline of all. The Weasley family, despite all their warmth and chaos, had cracks. Percy was one. And Fred and George, for all their brilliance, never filled that crack with anything but mockery. There's a moment in Order of the Phoenix when Dumbledore says, "Indifference and neglect often do much more damage than outright dislike." Perhaps Fred and George didn't hate Percy. Perhaps they simply stopped caring enough to try. And that's what hurt the most. In the years that followed, George carried the twin burdens of memory and regret. Weasley's Wizard Wheezes became a monument to what they had built and what had been lost. Percy, ever formal, returned to the family fold, but a shadow hung over their interactions. A ghost named Fred, who never laughed again. No one spoke of it directly, but the silence said enough. Some fans claim Fred and George were justified, that Percy had turned his back first, that he earned the ridicule, but forgiveness is not earned, it is given, especially in families, especially in war. And Fred and George, for all their spark, never lit the way home for their brother. Instead, they watched from the shadows, cloaked in sarcasm. In a story filled with giants and goblins, dementors and dragons, this was one of the quietest tragedies. A brother left in the cold. Two brothers too proud to reach out. And when one fell, it was too late. Fred's death ended the chapter, but the pain of that unwritten reconciliation lingers between the lines. Number 29, they ignored the importance of education. Fred and George Weasley were not just pranksters. They were revolutionaries of mischief, icons of rebellion, and legends in the corridors of Hogwarts. But behind their fireworks, enchanted suites, and dramatic exits, there was something darker, an attitude that dismissed the value of education, an influence that reached far beyond their own futures and left a lasting imprint on how many young witches and wizards viewed learning itself. From their very first years at Hogwarts, Fred and George made their stance clear. School was something to be mocked, not respected. They parodied lessons, played tricks on teachers, and devoted more time to inventing joke products than mastering the magical disciplines being taught. In their fourth year, for example, they turned a corridor into a swamp. Filch was furious. Flitwick was impressed. But what about the younger students who saw that act not as a prank, but as a message? that disrupting class was more admirable than attending it. Their behavior wasn't just limited to jokes. In Order of the Phoenix, Fred confidently declared, "Who cares if we're not on the shortlist for prefects? We've got our own stuff going on." That stuff included black market betting, dangerous magical items, and an underground joke shop operation. Their priorities were clear: innovation over instruction, flair over facts. When the twins dropped out of Hogwarts in a blaze of fireworks and rebellion, it became one of the most iconic moments in the series. They mounted their brooms, left behind their exams, and flew into the unknown. To many, it was heroic. To others, including younger Gryffindors like Colin Creevey and even some Ravenclaws, it was a signal that success didn't require effort, study, or discipline. It required charm and timing. The message was infectious. Fred and George were undeniably gifted. Their talent for invention was beyond most adult wizards. Skiving snack boxes, extendable ears, portable swamps. These weren't the work of amateurs. But even talent needs structure. Even genius needs grounding. Their products could have caused harm. One of their experimental sweets left a second year vomiting uncontrollably. It was funny, until it wasn't. McGonagall confiscated the box and scolded them harshly. "This is not a joke shop," she said sternly. "This is a school." They laughed. But what was Hogwarts teaching? To most students, it was a place of profound magical education, transfiguration, charms, potions, defense against the dark arts. For Hermione Granger, it was a temple of knowledge. She cherished every moment, every assignment, and yet even she couldn't resist Fred and George's charm. "They're amazing, aren't they?" she once said, despite criticizing their skipping classes. The twins had the power to enchant not only objects, but minds. Their attitude toward learning wasn't harmless. It created a culture. In Half-Blood Prince, Seamus Finnegan famously struggled with his grades, yet still spent more time imitating Fred and George's antics than studying. "They made school fun," he said. But that fun came at a cost. Students who needed discipline and direction were left adrift in an environment where diligence was overshadowed by spectacle. Even Percy Weasley, their own brother, criticized their apathy. "You're throwing away your futures," he yelled one Christmas. "You think life is just a joke?" Percy, for all his flaws, understood something important. Magic without responsibility is dangerous, and Fred and George, for all their brilliance, encouraged irresponsibility, not just through jokes, but through their philosophy. Professor Snape despised the twins, not just because of personal grievances, but because he saw what they represented: chaos. In one potions class, they swapped his ingredients with fireworks powder. The explosion was legendary, but the lesson was lost. "Do you think this is funny?" Snape growled. Fred smirked. George winked, and the class roared with laughter. Nobody remembered the potion they were supposed to learn. Even Dumbledore, who usually turned a blind eye to their behavior, had his limits. When the twins set off enchanted fireworks in the Great Hall, Dumbledore chuckled. But later, in private, he said to McGonagall, "Brilliance without balance is still recklessness." The headmaster saw the danger in their influence, but he, too, allowed it to flourish. The twins weren't evil. Far from it. They were brave, kind, and fiercely loyal. They fought at the Battle of Hogwarts. They risked their lives for the Order. Fred gave his life, but none of that erases the fact that they spent their formative years teaching others, through example, that education was a game, that professors were obstacles, that books were boring, and that magic was meant to entertain, not enlighten. When Ginny entered Hogwarts, she already had a rebellious streak. Some of it was hers, but some of it was inherited from watching her older brothers treat school like a stage. She skipped classes, defied teachers, and learned more from Fred and George than from her textbooks. It wasn't until after the Chamber of Secrets that she began taking education seriously. Fred and George could have been professors. They could have reformed the curriculum, built a new school, become magical entrepreneurs who supported Hogwarts from the outside. But instead, they chose to mock what they didn't like and abandon what they didn't understand. They built a business, but they could have built a legacy. Their influence wasn't just limited to Gryffindor. Even students from Hufflepuff and Ravenclaw began to see school as secondary. Fred and George made more in a year than I'll make in a decade, said one seventh year from Ravenclaw. What's the point of any witties? That cynicism wasn't born in a vacuum. It was fed by years of watching two of the most admired students undermine the very institution that taught them. Luna Lovegood, who admired the twins deeply, once said, "They see the world differently, I like that." And indeed, their perspective had value. They challenged authority, questioned rules, and brought laughter into dark times. But in doing so, they also damaged the integrity of learning. They made teachers look like fools and lessons look like chores. They turned magic into merchandise.